Hello and welcome back to another episode of the God Core Podcast. Today we are diving into the language of the stars in the Bible itself, and we're going to actually start seeing what the Bible has to say about the heavens, and then we're also going to be doing a kind of brief comparative theology over certain stories on the names that they used to explain constellations versus what other cultures used. Because what a lot of people might be unaware of is most of the ancient religions that are still kind of around today, even if they've taken on new names and symbolisms and meanings, they were built on astrotheology. Okay, and if you've been following along in this series with astro worship in the ancient world, you're probably starting to have that perspective and starting to think deeper, and different questions might be arising inside of you. If you've seen the Babylonians or the Persians or the Canaanites, and you also have the Egyptians and even the Greeks. The Greeks have 4 different errors, and then depending on the error, their understanding of like their gods definitely changed. And so it gets really fun and exciting, but it can also get confusing really quick if you aren't somebody who has like constellations memorized in your mind. And so if you are somebody looking to get into starting to understand constellations, I would definitely dive into like Egyptian or Greek mythologies. Greek mythologies for me was my gateway as a child. Like that was my gateway drug into realizing all of these ancient cultures told the same stories just with their own language of the stars. You know, you have Perseus and you have Andromeda and you have Cassiopeia, and all of these kind of stories take on their own tellings, and the Greeks definitely liked having their contradicting stories too, which is like why I love the Greeks so much. But yeah, so it makes for a lot of fun. And so for a few things that I do want to just go over briefly for you to think on is in Christianity and in the Bible, you definitely see stories like Nimrod and Orion. You see Jacob's 12 sons and the 12-fold celestial order. You have Joseph's dream about the sun, the moon, and the 11 stars. You have Balaam's star out of Jacob. You have Deborah's stars fighting from heaven. We talked about that with the Bow cycle, and I can link that up there for you if you haven't seen that. You have Job's Leviathan and dragon alongside celestial serpent imagery. You see that also, again, showing up with the Canaanites. They have their own serpent. You see other cultures having their just kind of celestial serpent imagery. You have the Queen of Heaven and the material that we're going to talk about in the book of Jeremiah. You have the book of Amos with Saturn, and you have the Magi and the star. We're also going to be talking about the book of Amos today because Amos has quite a bit of celestial imagery going on. You have Revelation's woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet and the crown of 12 stars and the dragon sweeping a third of heaven's stars. Revelation takes imagery from Isaiah and Daniel and Ezekiel and even like Enoch, and it reimagines it in its new time period that those stories were being written like after and during Second Temple Judaism. And Revelation is quite the esoteric book about psychology and about the heavens. Like if you can understand the stars, Revelation becomes, this is a lot less mystical than the modern day church wants to make it. You know, certain denominations are all about, we need to decode Daniel and Revelation. Jesus is coming back any day now. No, it's pretty easy to read if you just understood the stars, but most people are afraid of the stars and afraid of astrology because of Christian indoctrination going on in your head. It's like, ooh, that's evil. Because they like to demonize everything that they're unfamiliar with, but that's also how cults work. Either way, before we dive in, though, to the topics that we're going to talk about today, I do want to clarify 2 things from last week's video that I definitely saw comments on, and I've gotten some DMs. And so this one actually combined both of them that a viewer emailed me about. So I'm going to read it to you, and then we're going to answer it. So one viewer emailed me asking, "Hi Finn, I just watched your royal priesthood video and I love your YouTube channel. It has been a great help in my deconstruction process, but I was hoping you could clarify a few things for me. I was born November 19th, which is the zodiac Scorpio, but does that actually mean I am Ophiuchus?" No. I do want to make that clear because I saw a lot of comments of like, actually I'm Ophiuchus. No one is Ophiuchus, and that is because everyone is Ophiuchus, okay? So if you look here, I know it's a little bit hard to see. You do have Ophiuchus, okay? And then you have Sagittarius, and you have Scorpio. And like if you look, because this is the northern sky, because we're in the northern hemisphere, so you'll see the path of the sun, okay? You have Scorpius, you have Sagittarius, Ophiuchus, so the sun technically does pass through Ophiuchus. That is why it's the hidden 13th zodiac. But it will never be your sun sign, it will never be your moon sign, and it will never be your rising sign, because that is how the ancients work, okay? When you study ancient astrology, like in the ancient world, and you understand patterns, and you understand numbers, and you understand like mathematics and structures of things, which is definitely like Hellenistic Greeks, where they started combining all these different traditions, and that's where you started to see a lot of like mystery schools emerging, which is a totally different topic. you will know that 12 is the structure of the material, just like all of the 12 zodiac, okay, Aries all the way around to Pisces will have a element. It will have fire, it will have earth, it will have water, it'll have air, and then they are structured into decans. You know, like within them you have 3 decans in each zodiac. And then you also have your quadrants, which is how certain like astrologers will look at the charts depending on like where you're born. So like, let's say if you're an Aquarius sun like I am, you would be in the 4th quadrant, which means what they believe on that is you came into this world with higher consciousness than somebody born of the 1st quadrant, you know? So like, for example, the tarot cards, you see the soul's journey of like consciousness emerging and growing. That's kind of the same material that's going on in the zodiac, you know, it's growing and evolving. Okay, so nobody is going to be Ophiuchus, and that is because it's the 13th. It is the one outside of the structure of the 12, okay, of that kind of completion. It goes onward, and that is because then everybody is Ophiuchus, because the element of Ophiuchus is ether. You have 5 elements, but most people only know of 4. The 5th one, though, being spirit, that divine substance. In Christian theology, that would be known as imago Dei. You know, you're made in the image of God, okay, in life itself, from source, omni. From the all comes all things, okay? And that is where it is the wounded healer, and also known as the serpent bearer, because, you know, what it wounded you then also can heal you. You have to emerge, you know, healers have the bloodiest hands because they've walked through the darkness, and that is then where you see that symbolism showing up with heroes throughout the ancient stories. And you see even, you know, Jesus referencing himself as I will be lifted up, because the ego has to die, the flesh has to be put to death, so that way the consciousness can be birthed inside of you. And then the spirit and the soul starts to learn to command this chariot, you know, your emotions and your thoughts, the masculine and the feminine, the right and left hemispheres of the brain, whatever terminology you want to use depending on the tradition that you're going on. And so yeah, I hope I can clarify that. If anybody's telling you you're Ophiuchus and you've been lied to, they don't know what the fuck they're talking about, at least in my opinion. Feel free to disagree. Either way, we're going to continue reading on their email, and it said, I noticed you said the Levite symbol in the serpent, and I assume you mean the serpent bearer because Moses being a part of the tribe of the Levites. But can you clarify that, please? Because in the Bible it says that the serpent is associated with the tribe of Dan, and the breastplate is the Levites. But I also know some traditions associated the scales with Dan because his name means judgment. It's all a bit confusing when you get into symbolism, and any help would be great. Thanks. Absolutely. And this was something as I was like editing my video, I was like, I forgot to clarify, because like in my head it's like all there, and then I'm like, yeah, but they don't know that. So when you read in Genesis 49:17, you see that Dan shall be a serpent by the way. Okay, and Dan's name does mean judgment, just like Ephraim means to be fruitful and multiply, because it also has to refer to like the intellect. And then Reuben is behold a man. And so if you remember last week's video, or if you've seen my video on like the 4 corners of the world, which I made a long time ago, you have the cosmic cross, okay? It's the fixed elements of the zodiac, okay? You have all of your tribes in a camp, but then each one of them, okay, Dan represents Scorpio, and then Judah is the lion, and then you have Reuben, Aquarius, and then you have Taurus, the fixed zodiac of the ox, which is Ephraim. What you don't realize in modern day astrology, people associate Scorpion with Scorpio. But in ancient astrology, the symbol for Scorpio was the snake, the serpent. Because when you study symbolism, like in different cultures, and you just study symbolism across the board, like in esoteric work, symbols overlap. And I should have clarified that last week. And so the snake is not evil. The snake means wisdom, and you need to have wisdom to have good judgment. Okay. Another symbol that takes on with the with Scorpio is the eagle, and then you also have the phoenix in certain mythologies. And so, since symbols overlap, that is also where certain traditions have associated scales with Dan. Now, you might, if you study astrology and you like that kind of stuff, be like, no, Libra is scales, because Libra is all about balance. But judgment is also scales, because then when you go into Egyptian mythologies, remember, Egyptians have a lot of their mythologies as well, you have the weighing of the heart against the feather of Ma'at. Okay, your heart gets placed on the scale, and then the feather weighs it to see how corrupt or not you were. And then in your next life, you know, if you've got karma to pay back and all of these other things that other cultures also talk about, and the Bible does as well. I do also now want to address the symbolism of the Levites, because in Exodus 28:15-30, you see the breastplate of judgment. Now, on that breastplate, you see 12 stones, and each stone represents the tribes, and they are also the same stones that you see showing up in Revelation 21:19 through 20. And that, again, if you remember just a little bit ago, the writers of the New Testament reimagined the stories that we have in our Old Testament. Okay, and a lot of these stories that were written and that are now in your modern day Bible were written during Second Temple Judaism period. Okay, they were being compiled and put together, and that was after they were in Babylon, and that's during the Persian reign, and that's where you definitely see the theological development happening, and that's where a lot of this kind of cosmic warfare is coming on scene in the Bible. If you remember watching the Persian video, because they were all about like good versus evil, and that's where then Satan, Hasatan, which was a neutral military kind of position, it's also a star, is being then reimagined as, fighting against God. And that's then where all of these different branches of theology over the years have emerged. I'm like, well, God can't look upon evil, but Satan's evil, so then how is Satan going in there? And then everyone's getting confused because they're putting theology over these texts and reading them through a Western lens rather than just understanding the Eastern culture that they're written in. It's also common among certain traditions, it's worth noting, to notice the correlation of the stones that are on the breastplate for the tribe of the Levites to the zodiac, okay? Zodiac has certain stones, just like your chakras, they have certain stones associated to them. And that's why you might say it's called a birthstone, like if you're... if you're Aquarius, you have amethyst, you have the purple stone, and that's where certain stones do get associated to a zodiac. And the symbolism is there nonetheless, and so the high priest, when you understand that, is essentially carrying a miniature cosmos on his chest. Okay, he has all of the tribes on his chest, and again, though, the Levites represent the 13th tribe. You have 12 tribes, you have 12 zodiac, but then you have the 13th, okay, the one that steps outside of the wheel, the one that's behind the wheel. Okay, they are the intermediaries between heaven and earth, okay, the high priest, just as you can go between heaven and earth, and you also have your heart chakra, which is the bridge between the two, and I have a video on that. And so when you know that, and you read, and you continue reading the stories, that is then where the Levites, their symbol is the serpent bearer, okay, because the 13th zodiac, Ophiuchus, is the serpent bearer, the one who then is lifted up, and you see that also showing up again with Asclepius. Asclepius was around before Jesus' stories ever came on scene. Okay, and then also in the ancient world in Babylon, you have Inanna, which then got reimagined as Ishtar because Inanna was like the Sumerians, and then when the Babylonians took it over, they changed it. So you have these archetypes, okay, showing up in the ancient world, telling of these stars, and then they're just being reimagined in their storytelling. So I hope that clarifies. I'm sorry for not clarifying it on the last time, but I do want to now dive into the language of the stars rather than rambling, is to not waste your time. Okay, so if you have your Bibles, open up into the book of Genesis, the beginning. In the Hebrew, it is the beginning principle itself. That's what it translates to. And this is a story, mind you, if you're reading this esoterically, you're going to the level of Sod, the fourth level of Pleiades, on how consciousness and creation happens. But today we're going to focus more on the first layer of just reading it and what it has to say in the English about the stars. And so in Genesis 1:14, it says, "And God said, let there be lights in the firmament of heaven to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and for years." Okay, and let them be for lights in the firmament in the heaven to give light upon the earth, and so it was. Genesis does not introduce the heavens merely as decoration. Okay, we are already seeing here, literally in verse 14, before there is a temple, before there's a priesthood, the sky itself is already being said to function as a clock. And we know that because if you've been following along, that's what they believed in the ancient world, that they were there for signs and seasons and times and appointed periods. And that's also where you get sometimes your theology of, like, let's say the Seventh-day Adventists. They are, your Sabbath keepers. And then you have your Yahuwah movement, which makes those people look like amateurs in their Sabbath keeping and all their Torah rule keeping. Either way, that is where they have this ideology that, listen, it's been the same 7 days since the beginning of creation, and it's never changed. So that's why Saturday is the one true day. And that sounds good if you don't really think about it until you actually study, how calendars changed in the ancient world. And no, that is such a strawman fallacy fucking argument. It's honestly sad. Either way, circling back, the sky itself functions as a clock, okay? And the sun, the moon, the stars are placed in the heavens for appointed times and seasons. And if you want to understand what the ancient Jewish writers could do with that idea, you do need to leave Genesis for a moment and open the book attributed to the man known as Enoch, which is why I did bring up that little rant there just moments ago, because this is where it gets fascinating. I don't know if you've ever read the book of Enoch. It's a whole fucking book on stars. Like, it is literally talking about the stars through and through 10 times over, okay? So in 1st Enoch 72 through 82, it is an entire section devoted to the heavens, okay? To the heaven luminaries, commonly called as the astronomical book or the book of heavenly luminaries. And it describes the movements of the sun, the moon, the stars, the seasons, the months, and the years revealed to Enoch. And earlier, Enoch actually describes and is described recording the stars in 1st Enoch 33, 2 through 4. Okay, that chapter and that portion of the books of Enoch describe Enoch describing the stars emerging and writing down their names, their times, their seasons, their regulations, and their operations as Uriel explains them. And so with Enoch, you see that Enoch takes the language of Genesis and expands it into an entire cosmology. Like, when you deep dive and you study the book of Enoch, and Uriel doesn't simply show Enoch that the stars exist, Enoch is taught their courses. This man was like mastered in understanding the courses of the stars, the constellations, where they were, their names, their seasons, their appointed time, and how the sun passed through them and everything else, okay? He is portrayed in these books as someone capable of reading that celestial order and recording it for all of humanity. That was his task. So I don't know if you know this, but in order to record something and translate it and put it down for humanity, you have to kind of have it mastered. You know, you can't just be starting out on like 2 + 2 = 4. Like, no, you got to know calculus. Like, you got to be all the way up there in fucking rocket science mathematics of understanding this. Just like Daniel, he was appointed what? Head of the Magi, head of the astrologers, head of the priests, head of all of these people. That wasn't just because, oh, well, God favored him. No, he understood it better than everyone else. Even you see that showing up in Proverbs, that a master of their craft takes a backseat to no one. They will go before kings. So these people that started going before kings, that started being elevated into these positions, they knew the stars. They knew what they were being appointed to and to be appointed over. Okay? You're not just going to be, oh, God's favorite person, just get appointed over, and you're this amateur of like, yeah, that one I think is the Big Dipper. No. You're going to fucking know the constellations better than everyone else around you, and you're going to have knowledge that nobody else can attain to and master up to your level. Just to clarify that, okay? So then in 1st Enoch 75:3, it explicitly associates the heaven luminaries with the signs and the times and the years and the days. And so that's remarkably close to what we're also seeing again, going back to Genesis 1:14. Genesis 1:14, signs, appointed times, days, years. 1st Enoch chapter 75, signs, times, years, days. And then in 1st Enoch 79, 1 through 2, it says that Enoch has been shown the law or the ordinance of the stars for every day, season, year, month, and week. And so 1st Enoch 82 returns to that same concept when you keep reading, and Uriel reveals that the luminaries, the months, the festivals, the years, and the days, while the stars occupy their places according to seasons, festivals, and months. So there is this consistent thread running throughout the Jewish writings, whether you read the ones taken out of the Bible or not, throughout also the astronomical book found in Enoch, that the heavenly movements are a measurement of sacred time, which is also what you see showing up in Egypt, in the Babylonian Empire, with the Persians, with the Canaanites, and all the other people of the ancient world who studied the stars. And you also see that showing up over like with the Aztecs and the Mexican culture and all of those cultures over like with the Native Americans. I just don't bring that up here because they do slightly branch off into their own thing. So when teaching people the Eastern world, you stay in the Eastern world for anthropology. And then you go to the Western world for that anthropology. And then when you read in the Book of Jubilees, it actually makes Enoch's connection explicit. So that's another book that, if you've never studied it, I would encourage you to check it out. It's really cool. Because Jubilees is intensely concerned with sacred chronology, so much though that one of the ancient titles associated with it is essentially, like when you translate it to the English, the Book of Divisions of the Times. Okay? So, if all of these ancient people are saying, yeah, the stars are there, and then when you study throughout history, all of these great leaders, they had their spiritualists, of like, yeah, we should probably check with our stars. You know, Christian Dior, he was just like, I need to see my spiritualist first. JP Morgan, a billionaire, he's like, billionaires use astrology. The ancients knew what was up, and it's our own modern day ignorance to say that the stars are just there. And so in Jubilees 4:17, it says of Enoch that he was the first human to learn writing, knowledge, and wisdom, and that he recorded the signs of heaven. So humanity could know the seasons of the years according to their months. And it's also worth noting that scholars and historians who study these have also long noted the relationship between the passage of the astronomical traditions preserved in Enoch 1. Like when you read the book of Jubilees, and that's why usually I just bring them up together when I talk about them, because you see the same patterns that also again are then emerging in Genesis. So let's think about the progression here. Genesis tells us that the appointed times can be known by the stars. Enoch ascends into heaven and is taught the courses, the seasons, the names, the months, and the ordinances of the celestial bodies, okay, where they are in the sky. And then Jubilees remembers Enoch as the man who wrote the heavenly signs down for humanity to understand the divisions of time. Divisions of time as in seasons, as in you have 12 divisions in this clock of the cycles, and then every now and then they would have their 13th month because they kept with the cycles of also the moon. So that means the sky within the ancient Jewish text, within these writings, is not meaningless. It is ordered, it is measured, and it is a calendar written across the heavens. So then that raises another question for us, and that raises the question that I had back in the day. When the ancient people spoke of heavenly signs, where did astronomy end and astrology begin? And as you saw with Babylon, they were one of the two of the same, okay? They were interwoven. You did not separate them as we separate them now. And that's where sometimes I think the confusion can come, at least I know that was my confusion back in the day, is you would be studying the heavens, astronomy-wise, you'd be like, wow, that's so cool. Oh, look, that's a Leo, that's Libra. There's all these signs. And then you realize, oh, that's on zodiac. But then you have this mind block in your head of ooh, astrology, that's evil. I can't touch that. I'm going to be entertaining demons, because that's how mind blocks work. And then when you start studying the ancient world, you realize that they're one and two of the same. They didn't separate them how we separate them in modern day. With that being said, to answer that question, I do want us to turn to the book of Job. Now, Job is honestly one of my favorite books, and it was one of the first books that I really started thinking about how much these are actually just writings of the stars and esoteric writings and mythologies. And Job is a story that is actually set outside the land of Israel, in the land of Uz. And the name Job actually means the one under examination, when you translate it to the Hebrew. And so one of the things I love about Job, it is an absolute goldmine for astral symbolism. Passage after passage, you're seeing astrology show up in these stories, okay? So in Job 38:31-33, it says, God points Job towards the heavens. Can thou bind the sweet influence of Pleiades, okay? And Pleiades is the seven sisters, which we'll talk about momentarily. Or can you loose the bands of Orion? Can thou bring forth the Mazzaroth in his season? Or can thou guide Arcturus with his sons? And can thou knowest the ordinances of heaven? Can thou set the dominion thereof of the earth? Okay, so we are seeing this progression of constellations being spoken of. Okay, you have Pleiades, you have Orion, you have the Mazzaroth, which we're going to actually talk about here, of breaking down the Hebrew, because that is what we are going to say is the zodiac. And here's why. Because the Mazzaroth is where things get kind of interesting. I don't want to ruin my map. Okay, because what is the Mazzaroth? So in the Hebrew, when you're reading Hebrew of the Bible, in Job 38:32, it reads Mazzaroth. And then of course they have their Hebrew symbolism, but I'm not writing that on the board. Okay, and the exact meaning remains to be debated today, but lexicons and translations commonly understand it again as referring to the constellations as in the 12 zodiac, because when you notice the wording of in its seasons, that is significant alongside Genesis 1:14 of let them be for signs and seasons. So Job is being asked if humans can bring forth the constellations in their seasons. Can you bring about the Mazzaroth? And so this appears a biblical concept of the heavens when you study the ancient world of appointed cycles, because the zodiac originally was referred to as the celestial band in the constellations associated with the sun's apparent path, and the sun would go through them in its seasons. Okay, and this is also where it gets fun, because then there's Mazzaroth. Okay, and so this is where the rabbit hole kind of gets deeper, because in 2 Kings 23:5, if you read there, you see the word Mazzaroth. And so during Josiah's religious reform, the text describes removing priests who had burned incense, okay, unto Baal, to the sun, into the moon, into the planets, Mazzaroth, okay, instead of Mazzaroth, it's Mazzaroth. into the host of heaven. And depending on the translation, this gets rendered as constellations, planets, or signs of the zodiac. And so this is important because they are two slightly different words, but they are not identical. So the precise linguistics of it, when you translate, is still again to be debated, but both occur in celestial context. Okay, that's the important thing to note when you are translating, is both have to do with the celestial stars in the heavens, because then in the later Hebrew, there's another word. And so this is a later Hebrew word that does become the ordinary word associated with the zodiacal signs in the constellations, and then eventually also fortune and astrological influence. So this is also where you get the expression. Mazzaroth develops the same sense of fortune and luck, although throughout history it is connected to the celestial influence. So then when you have Mazzaroth, you're seeing it as simply more than just congratulations, because that's what it means in the modern sense. Congratulations, if you ever go to a Jewish celebration. And so then when you go back into Job and you see that God is asking Job, can you know the ordinances? Can you set the dominion thereof of the earth? Can you appoint these times and seasons? You are seeing the fixed laws of heaven in statutes and ordinances, because that's what the words translate to in the Hebrew, showing up. And this language fits beautifully beside the Enoch material that we were just discussing, again, about Genesis of heavenly bodies, signs, and appointed seasons. Now Job is being asked, can you put these into times and seasons? Are you the one to appoint these, or am I the one that appoints all of these things? The Hebrew Bible basically presents celestial signs as meaningful, as well as condemning the worship of celestial bodies. And that's where it can sometimes get confusing, especially if you're somebody starting to understand the Bible through the lens of the stars, is because you're wait a second, I thought that they weren't supposed to worship the stars, so that's why astrology is evil. And that's usually where the argument comes from Christians of why you shouldn't study astrology, except you can understand astrology without worshiping them, just like you can collect rocks and have rocks in your house without worshiping them, just you can hang up crosses on your wall without worshiping it. When it becomes an idol of worship and you forget what the symbols represent, now it's a problem. Okay, and that is the problem that you do see emerging, no matter what group, is the ego loves to perform. So whether you're part of New Age or Old Orthodox religion, the ego likes to identify with titles and labels and symbols rather than understanding what those symbols meant for your soul's journey. And so Genesis doesn't say worship the stars, it says that the stars are there for signs. And so when you make that distinction of understanding of okay, if these stars are here for signs, then what do those signs mean? Now you can then begin understanding what the zodiac means in their appointed seasons, because everything is energy. And that's metaphysics for you when you study metaphysics on how energy and consciousness creates, is you have the consciousness and then you have your free will of yin and yang, that polarity, and then you go to pre-atom, atom, all the way down, elements, plants, animals, humans, consciousness keeps expanding and developing, okay? And so if everything's energy, and each of these stars, as we're seeing, can you bind the sweet influence of Pleiades in the moon, also we know does influence water, and we are made of water, then we know that these stars have energy principles that are influencing us. And that's then where people who are big into the stars and certain witches will perform and cast certain spells with certain celestial times. And that's also where I'm going to be completely frank, if you're let's say a conspiracy theorist, if you study what certain events happen around certain times and then you look at the planetary alignments that are happening, you start seeing patterns emerge. Okay, so that actually brings me to my next point in Job. In Job 1:6, you actually see, now there came a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. And so in the literary world of Job, Hasatan functions like a heavenly prosecutor. Okay, he is a neutral, military position challenger, and he is not this arch enemy, which is later kind of Christian theology, which definitely emerges after the Persian thought, because Persia again had their definitely cosmic war of good and evil, and that's where we're starting to see that theological development in these texts. And then as the Christian kind of cult came on scene, and then Orthodox and all of that in the ancient world, and then we had the death of the classical world, you see a lot of different kind of thought processes emerging. Either way, going back to the book of Job with Jewish thought, let's say you study Jewish mysticism of let's say the Kabbalah or that, they believe Hasatan's job is to actually push you closer to God. okay? Because God is just the giver and giver of good gifts. And so Hasatan's job is to see if you're worthy of those good gifts. And Hasatan doesn't care if you call him evil, because Hasatan just has a job. And his job is to challenge you, to accuse you, the one under examination. Okay, you're being refined in this moment. Hasatan does not storm heaven. He presents himself before the other heavenly beings in the book of Job. And he can't simply do whatever he wants to Job, because God establishes the boundaries of what he is permitted to do. And you see this in Job chapter 1, verse 12, and also in chapter 2, verse 6. And then you also see in the book of Job that he connects these divine beings to the stars. When you read in Job chapter 38, 7, you see Job describes creation when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy. The poetic parallel, we're seeing morning stars, sons of God. And then when you know the ancient world, again, courts of heaven, they had the stars, they had the planets, they had the sons of God up there. So now we need to remember that, okay, these writers are writing from Babylon, they're writing from Persia, they're using these systems. Now they're telling this story, one of these older stories that is in this book. Interesting. So then that asks the question, who or what is Hasatan? Okay, if Hasatan is being compared, the son of God, as also the morning stars in the court of heaven, what star does Hasatan represent? That's a great question. So hopefully that stays. If not, I'll just have to hold it back up. Now this is a Greek mythology book, okay? If you heard me at the beginning, I love Greek mythology. Greek mythology for me as a child was my gateway drug into the ancient world. And after the Greeks, I went to the Romans. After the Romans, I went to the Egyptians. After the Egyptians, I went to the Norse. And I just kept following my way around the ancient world. And that's when I started realizing all of these stories are talking about the stars. So Greek mythology, in my opinion, is also the easiest to understand. Maybe it's just because maybe I'm biased and it was the first thing I learned, so it's the thing that's oldest in my brain. Either way, I say it's the easiest because the Greeks definitely use the name of the stars in their like kind of classical Greek era of the stories that they tell. With that being said, Greek mythology, if you've ever read Greek mythology, you'll probably remember the story of Perseus, okay? We talked about this. Perseus fights what? Fights Medusa. He takes and cuts off her head, okay? Medusa represents Algol. And Algol, if you want to know how that's spelt, okay? Algol is known as the demon head for the peculiar way that this star acts and kind of flickers in and out every, I believe it's like 2.27 days, like its time period. I don't remember off the top of my head the exact time period. Either way, Algol is the demon head, and then of course, if you know the stories, Perseus goes on to marry Andromeda, the daughter of Cassiopeia, and all these other stories are happening in the ancient stars. Well, in Hebrew mythology, okay, they call it Rosh Ha-Satan. 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 Are you seeing? Is it clicking? Like, I know that probably is a stupid question to ask you, but I've literally explained this to people and they're like, I don't get it. And that's just how deep mind blocks run in the brain when you are raised in high control, like fundamentalist religion, and you have to spend a lot of time deconstructing, okay? And so then when the writers were starting to translate all these things, we have just shortened down Hasatan to Satan, okay? But in the Hebrew storytellings and the mythologies, it is Hasatan or Rosh Ha-Satan for Algol, and Algol takes on Medusa, and all of these stories in the ancient world have their own tellings of the stars, okay? Just like if you remember in the video about the Babylonians, we cleared up the bad theology with the church about Lucifer, okay? If you grew up in Christianity, you probably hear that and you're like, that's the name of the devil. No, Lucifer is simply Latin for morning star, as in Venus, okay? The same terminology also shows up in Revelation 22 verse 16, with Jesus himself in reference of I am like the morning star. So either Jesus is referring to himself as the devil, okay, if you're going to stick with Christian theology, which means you probably shouldn't follow Jesus, or maybe, just maybe, these are all mythologies about the stars. And that is also something I do want to clarify real quick that can get confusing when reading the mythologies, is the same character can take on different positions and they can become like in reference to like, I'm like the morning star, okay, Venus. Or you're going to see in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John that Jesus takes the hero's journey, that's what it's called in the ancient world, of the sun, okay? The hero journey takes the path of the sun, and then it goes through the whole kind of constellations, yada, yada, X, Y, Z. But then in Revelation, it's in reference to Venus. And you also see that showing up with the book of Esther, okay? And we'll talk about that in a little while. I do want to just run through a few other kind of just like side-by-side comparisons of the words that the Hebrews use in their writings to then talk about the stars. So in Job 9:9 or Job 38:31 or Amos 5:8, you do have in reference to Pleiades, that's the word that they use. The next constellation and Hebrew word is this word, and that is used in reference to Orion. And you see that showing up in Job, Amos, and Isaiah. And it does translate to the fool, and then in certain traditions, in reference to the celestial giant. And another name that the mythologies use, especially in these writings, is Nimrod. Okay, so in Genesis 10, if you want to turn there real quick, we can read it. You see, and it says, "In Cush began Nimrod, he began a mighty one in the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord." And so then when you start studying the ancient mythologies, you see that later Jewish interpretive tradition definitely turns Nimrod from Genesis, this mighty hunter, into the archetype of the rebellious ruler associated with Babel. Okay, and this is where then the imagery starts becoming striking when you start studying comparative theology, because Nimrod is the mighty man, the hunter, the associated with Babel and Mesopotamia, later portrayed as a rebel against heaven in the primeval kind of king warrior. And then Orion is the enormous celestial warrior, the hunter, the ancient constellation, and then sometimes interpreted as the rebellious celestial figure. And so they overlap, and then traditions do identify them and compare them with each other. And so then the next one is you have Ash, which is the great bear, Ursa Major, or another prominent group showing in Job 9:9 and then 38:32. And then you have your chambers of your south, your southern stars in Job 9:9. You have your morning star, Venus, in Isaiah 14:12, and then also again in Revelation. And then you also have associated with Saturn in its Mesopotamian context, this word. And you see that in Amos 5:26, and then you also have northern constellations showing up in Job 37 verse 39. And so with that being said, I do want to actually go over to Amos real quick and keep us kind of going along. I know I might be moving a little fast, but I'm trying to get all this done for you guys. And so in Amos chapter 8, verses 1 through 2, you see that the Lord showed unto me, behold, a basket of summer fruit. And there's actually some clever Hebrew wordplay happening here at its center, because when God asks Amos what he sees, Amos answers a basket of summer fruit. And then God says that the end has come upon Israel. And so the vision works through sound, because that's how they believe creation also happens when you study the Sefer Yetzirah. And so the ripened fruit signals that Israel has reached the end of the allotted season, and that then judgment is ripe. Okay, so summer fruit, the end. And so then in Amos 8 verse 9, it says, "I will make the sun go down at midday, and I will darken the earth in the day of light." Okay, so this chapter begins with a celestial sign, summer fruit marking the end of a cycle, and then later gives a solar sign, the sun darkening in the middle of the day. And so this has naturally raised the question, like when you study the ancient world, whether Amos preserves a memory of a solar eclipse, because then when you study a major Assyrian recorded solar eclipse that happened approximately June 15th, 763 BCE, which happened in the world that the book of Amos would have been around and being written in within the broader 8th century world. And I also want to make note that these ancient tribes were worshiping different ancient deities. And this wasn't like we worship this false god for like 5 days, and then a prophet came and been like, "Oh, bad you guys, I'm gonna put you in timeout." No, they were worshiping these ancient deities for centuries. Okay, and different tribes within the tribes of Israel and within these storytellings that we see were worshiping different deities depending on the tribes in the areas that they were at. And you even see this also showing up in Amos 8:14. It says, "Thy God, O Dan, liveth, and thy manner of Beersheba liveth, even they shall fall and never rise up again." And then you also see in Amos 5, verse 5, it says, "Do not seek Bethel nor Gilgal, and do not pass through Beersheba," because these pilgrimages were happening. They were taking these sacred pilgrimages to these cultic practice and to these centers of worship. And so you also know that this was a practice associated with sanctuaries there. Then when you study the ancient world on like the different kind of tribal things, and that's where everything unholy has been put into this holy book. Okay, there was multiple practices, and basically everything that is just under the sky, nothing new under the sun, has been put in here. That's why it's sometimes joked as the Holy Babel, the confusing of languages. And you also know that they were worshiping ancient deities because of Jeremiah's Queen of Heaven. In Jeremiah 17:18, it describes an entire household participating. The children gather wood, and the father kindles the fire, and the women knead the dough to make cakes to the Queen of Heaven. And then Jeremiah 44 becomes even more revealing because people openly tell Jeremiah that they intend to continue worshiping her. They say that they will burn incense to the Queen of Heaven and pour out drink offerings to her. They essentially tell Jeremiah in those passages, when you do study Jeremiah, that we worshiped her and things went well. They claim they have food and prosperity, but after stopping their offerings to the Queen of Heaven, they experience famine and warfare. And so Jeremiah, a prophet, obviously condemns this interpretation, but historically this passage is very valuable because it preserves the memory of actual popular religious practice among the Judaites. Okay? Again, each tribe had their own false deities. This idea in modern Christianity that there's just one true God, Yahweh's the one true God of everything, they didn't worship that much, they were only condemned once or twice. No. Okay? They worshipped multiple deities, multiple different periods through time, and that's even where you see Yahweh in his Asherah, because Yahweh was just another false deity. And that's an indoctrination point. If you're listening to this right now, you're like, no, Yahweh's the one true God. Says who? Says your religion? Have you actually studied what the war god Yahweh was? He was a very narcissistic god. Okay, he thought he was the greatest of all gods, that he was the one true God, and then his sister laughed at him. She was like, yeah, right. Okay, when you study these ancient stories, you start to see how much these people God hopped, because they wanted the best and the strongest God, and they were heavily influenced with the cultures that they were a part of. Just as you, when you travel somewhere, and like if you work like seasonal work, you start to be influenced by the culture. You know, if you're in the northern hemisphere, you're going to be influenced by the brands that are up there. When you go down to the southern hemisphere, you see different brands of clothing that are popular down there. And that is how the human conditioning works, because the mind is highly programmable and highly impressionable. Okay, why do you think mind control is so easy? Like, I'm just going to be completely frank, because everything in your day, especially if you live in America, is designed to program you. Okay, the music, the ads, the TV, all of it. All of this stuff is triggering. Why do you think they spend so much money on understanding the psyche of psychology when it comes to brand influence into making campaigns? Because certain colors affect the brain differently. Just like they've done studies where, like, when you are like playing like on a, like, let's say a soccer game, and one team is wearing red and the other team's wearing blue jerseys, the team wearing red has a slightly higher advantage of winning psychologically because of the colors. It's all there. Okay, so then all of these ancient symbols, like the stars, like let's talk about Pleiades real quick. Okay, the seven sisters. Every culture has their own telling of this. Well, what logo do we know of on a car that has the logo of seven sisters, basically? Oh, I don't know, Subaru? Have you actually looked at the symbolism of modern day society and seen how much they progress? Babylon never went away. I don't know if you know this, but their symbol was an eagle. Okay, what did the Romans take on? What does America take on? Double-headed eagles? Okay, you have to see how these symbols have never went away. There's nothing new under the sun. They just constantly keep being reinvented and reimagined, and that's what happened here. All of these gods just got reinvented. Just like all the stories of the stars, depending on the culture, they got reinvented into their own mythologies. So if you can get past the stigma of realizing that all of these cultures share symbolisms, and that's even like what Carl Jung dove into, was like the collective subconscious and like the collective shadow of realizing that these same stories of like the Epic of Gilgamesh and a flood was also being told in the Native Americas. Okay, now, does that actually mean it happened? Then that creates a new debate, you know, because we do have references of floods happening, but then where does the myth end and history begin? That's then the next question you need to ask. Either way, getting back on topic so we don't keep going on, this is where Venus enters, the Queen of Heaven, okay? And so one of the strongest candidates for the Queen of Heaven is Asherah. If you've been following along, you'll have remembered the Canaanite pantheon, El, okay? The high god El, he had his consort, Asherah, the Queen of Heaven. Asherah, Yahweh in his Asherah, we have that showing up. And this was a West Semitic goddess closely related to the broader Ishtar tradition, okay? Esther, Ishtar, Ashtar, all of these different names are kind of showing up in their own thing. And it's a celestial manifestation of Venus. Okay, the morning star and the evening star. And the biblical text independently attests that the Israelites knew and worshipped Ashtar. Okay, in 1 Kings 11:5, it calls her the goddess of the Sidonians, while the judges describe Israelites worshiping Baal and Asherah. So we know they worship the Queen of Heaven, which actually takes me to the book of Esther. So if you have your Bibles, you can turn there, but I am going to be reading out of my Catholic Bible for this, and this is the Douay-Rheims vision. And you might be saying, why, Finn, are we reading out of the Catholic and not the Protestant? And that's because the Catholic preserves chapters that the Protestant doesn't have. And now, yes, there is some different debates as to why the Protestants have taken out certain chapters over the years in certain books. I'm not getting into that debate today, but the Catholic Bible does preserve the Greek additions that were absent from the shorter Hebrew versions and from the Protestant version. And so chapters 11 through 16 restore material involving dreams, cosmic imagery, prayer, divine intervention, hidden meaning, and the interpretation of signs, especially when it comes to Mordecai's dream. And so, in other words, the Catholic version of Esther gives us something that the shorter version doesn't, and that is the story begins and ends with a symbolic cosmic vision. Because again, all these stories are talking about the stars. And it also helps to remember that these stories were written with a lot of influence from the Babylonians and the Persians. And I keep bringing that up because mind blocks will tell you that these texts just fell out of the sky. They emerged in isolation, and therefore they're the one true word of God, and nobody else in all their satanic demonic writings influenced them. And that's just heresy, okay? It's false. Like, these are heavily influenced by the ancient world, and it takes about 7 times for something to finally click into your brain and start actually being seated down. That's why we keep bringing it up. So, not to spend too much on this book, I do want to point out a few things personally for you to think on and study in and through the lens of astrotheology. And in chapter 10, verse 13, okay, if you go there, you see it says, "And these days shall be observed in the month of Adar, on the 14th and 15th day of the same month, with all diligence, and the joy of the people gathered into one assembly throughout all generations hereafter, the people of Israel." Now, it's also worth noting, where's my marker, that in the Jewish calendar, they have Adar 1 and Adar 2, okay? That would be known as Pisces. And so since the book does just say Adar, I'm going to assume it's Adar 1, not Adar 2. And if you're wondering where does Adar 2 come in, the Jewish calendars do keep to a 13th month occasionally to keep in the cycles with the lunar systems, because they had a lot of lunar cycles going in the ancient world. And so every now and then within the 19-year period, they would have on that extra month to make it 13 months, and that is also in reference to Pisces. Pisces is the 2 fish, okay? Pisces is the last, in the last quadrant of the zodiac. It's in the 4th quadrant. It's your last one around all 12, okay? That is where you see a lot of also fish symbolism showing up, like let's say with the cult of Christianity, like with Jesus, because it was in the age of Pisces. Now we're going into the age of Aquarius. It's kind of cool. So that's fun for you. Anyways, now let's look at Esther through the stars. Mordecai's dream opens like a cosmic drama of thunder and earthquake and darkness and 2 great dragons rising against one another, and then a tiny fountain that becomes a river before transforming into light and then into the sun. The text later tells us that these 2 dragons represent Mordecai and Haman. Well, the fountain that becomes the light and the sun represents Esther. So before the earthly events even unfold, they are presented through celestial and cosmic imagery in the book of Esther. Okay? Esther is being presented as the sun, and this is where I was talking about earlier, depending on the tradition and depending on the section of history and the section of the story and like the time period of the story, the imagery in the symbol for the character can change for the heavens. So Jesus in Revelation references morning star, okay, Venus. Okay, but then when you study, like, let's say, for example, the book of Mark is like my go-to when explaining the heavens and the stars for people, because that's like the first book I dissected at 17 of realizing, oh, this is just the sun going through the zodiac. Either way, you see that Jesus takes the hero's journey of the sun through the zodiac, but then Jesus also becomes what? The 13th zodiac, because these are different like parables and mythologies within one grand scheme. So even with the book of Esther, you're going to see this as we continue talking, that she here is being seen as the symbol of the sun, which is what? The risen savior of the world. She's the risen savior for her people, okay? We have to realize that before God's son, you also had goddesses, Okay, before God was a man, God was a woman. And there's actually great books on that. By Marilyn Stone, God was a Woman is a good one. And so Esther is the feminine, the divine feminine, the goddess, okay? So she is the risen savior. She is the divine feminine, okay? That is the sun that saves her people. And so then this becomes even more interesting, like when you do a deep dive into Esther, if you remember in Genesis 1:14, going back to the beginning of our video, okay, the stars and the lights of heaven are what? They're appointed for signs and for seasons and for days and for years. Well, Esther's story is obsessed with what? Those exact things: signs, months, appointed days, sacred timings, and the movement from darkness into light. And this is where we are specifically told to commensurate this cosmic reversal on the 14th and 15th days of Adar. Okay, and in the middle of the month, this happens around the full moon. And so meaning the sun and the moon stand approximately opposite of one another across the sky when the moon reaches its greatest illumination. And that's important to note because in Mordecai's dream, there's what? There's two opposing dragons. Haman casts the pur and creates two opposing destinies, and the story revolves around the celestial opposition of two great lights. So if this is happening on the 14th and 15th, you have the moon and you have the sun, the two great lights happening in the month of Adar. And this is also where it gets even more fun when you know Jewish culture, because Adar falls around February and March, specifically Pisces, March, okay, when the sun is moving through the late winter sky towards the spring equinox. So in tropical zodiac, this is commonly places the sun in Pisces, again, okay, Pisces, Adar, one fish, two fish, red fish, blue fish, during the opposing season with two opposing fishes, okay? And then this is where Purim is often occurring when the sun is in Pisces. Okay, there is a feast, it's a celebration, and this is the sign of the waters, which becomes intriguing, especially when you place it, besides Esther's dream of like the fountain of water, of many waters. Also, I find it interesting because Aquarius is like man with a pitcher of water. You see that symbolism showing up in the book of Luke. Yeah, it's Luke. Jesus says when you see the man with a pitcher of water, and this is a parable for two reasons. One, in that time period, it'd be very highly unusual for a man to be carrying a pitcher of water. That was a woman's job. So when you see a man carrying a pitcher of water in a story in that time period and context, of the culture, you'd be like, it's out of place. What the hell's going on? Yeah, it's talking about the heavens. Aquarius, man with a pitcher of water. Okay, either way, getting back to Esther, Haman looks to the heavens and calendars through the casting of pur to determine the month and the day. Okay, yet the fate associated with that day is ultimately reversed. And then again, when you understand Jewish culture, you have the Feast of Purim, the casting of lots, which reflects ancient Babylonian and Persian astrology practices, tracking the calendar days via the stars, which is still practiced in Jewish culture. These practices never went away. The stars are still here today. I don't know if you know this, but they're out every single night. And so these ancient stories, which if you understand Jewish culture, the Feast of Purim is the celebration and, of being freed, all this kind of stuff. That's what they tell you. This is ancient stuff happening still in modern day. Which actually takes me to the 7 maids. So Esther is attended by 7 maids, and in rabbinic tradition, this does correlate to the 7 sisters known as Pleiades, because when you study the ancient world, if you know anything about stories, so let's just use the Greek mythologies, the 7 sisters, the 7 daughters, the muses of Atlas, get turned into Pleiades up in the sky to protect themselves from the mighty hunter Orion. And then the story of Pleiades is found in cultures across the world. And when you study like anthropology, anthropologists believe that story of like Pleiades is one of humanity's oldest stories. And it's also worth noting that different esoteric traditions can have different understanding of these stories. That's one of the fun things about mythologies is the overlapping symbols. So for example, even Esther, again, you see that she represents the sun in the later chapters, but the symbolism at the beginning of the stories much more closely overlaps and relates to Venus. And you even see, again, different symbolism showing up with, let's say, Jesus, the risen savior of his people, okay? Through the Gospels, he represents the sun. Revelation, he represents Venus. So Esther, she is the savior of her people, appointed for such a time as this. You see it playing out with both the morning star and the sun, okay? And so the etymology of the name Esther itself is uncertain, but again, they do see, okay? And so now Esther's Hebrew/Jewish name means myrtle, while her public Persian identity is Esther. And so this immediately gives us the astrotheological lens, again, when you're reading it through, okay, how is this telling about the stars, of a hidden identity beneath a celestial identity. And so Mordecai becomes interesting in the stories because his name is commonly connected to Marduk, which is the Babylonian patron, if you remember watching the Babylonian video, whose deity in astral association commonly became important in Mesopotamian religions, okay? So you have already speculatively, like when you're studying this through the lens of astrotheology, of Esther being Ishtar, Venus, Mordecai being Marduk, and then the Persian Babylonian court, which is the celestial cosmic setting. Okay, because again, they had their celestial courts. So if Esther is the hidden star, the Hebrew root, also this is interesting to note, STR, means to hide or conceal. Okay, the Hebrew writers, they play on their storytelling a lot, like when you start studying like languages. So Jewish interpretation has long played with the similarity between Esther and Hester of the concealment, which does fit the book on her being hidden until the appointed time. So in this story, we're seeing this archetype of Esther conceals her Jewish identity. Mordecai tells her not to reveal her ancestry. The threat against the Jews develops behind palace walls. Esther's power initially exists unseen, and eventually everything concealed becomes revealed. And Venus itself, when you're studying, again, planetary systems and the stars in the heavens and celestial clock, it famously moves through cycles of visibility and invisibility. And that's what makes this story like so fascinating, like when you study it through the lens of astrotheology, is if Venus, the planet, all goes through this visible, invisible kind of cycle, appearing as the morning star, disappearing into the solar conjunction, and eventually emerging as the evening star, and then vice versa. That is a lot of the Ishtar and Inanna like imagery in their mythologies, and that is the same imagery then we're seeing with Esther. Another thing to note is the characteristics of Esther, okay? When you are looking at mythologies and you're starting to see their personalities, if you remember, let's say again, the Greek myths, you see a lot of characteristics depending on what Greek god represents what planet, you know, and you also see those characteristics showing up, like if you read like your astral chart or your astrocartography chart, you see the energy, like the role and the influence that the planet plays, whether it's an AC or a DC, and then an MC or an IC, depending on then where. So Esther in the stories doesn't initially conquer through military strength. She uses what? Beauty, favor, timing, feasting, relationship, and attraction. And these are all the characteristics that are placed with who? Aphrodite, which is who? Venus, okay? These are Venus characteristics. And then she does eventually become the mechanism through which death is reversed into life, which also gives us Venus not merely as beauty, but also the much older Eastern Venus archetype, which is love, sexuality, sovereignty, but also warfare, death, and regeneration. Okay? The divine feminine is both life and death. And you also see that showing up in like the Hindu, like if you ever study like Hinduism, like with Shiva and all those gods and goddesses and their stories, the older myths of the ancient world before they kind of, got a little bit whitewashed and watered down, they had a lot more contrasting polarities happening, and Aphrodite wasn't just love, okay? The divine feminine, this idea, especially in modern ideology, that being feminine just is soft and sweet. It's like, no. The divine feminine will fuck you up. I don't know if you've looked at the natural world. Mother Earth, she roars. I don't know if you look at the matriarchies in the animal kingdoms. The divine feminine mothers out there, they are love and light, but they will also protect their cubs, and they have that feminine rage, because the feminine rage is one of the strongest forces in that energy of like alchemy, of like taking energy and alchemizing it. Okay, so you see the feminine rages in these ancient stories, and then over time with translations, things are slowly just love and light. No, Venus was also death. She was beauty, but she also was war. Okay, you have this balance of harmony because everything in life is about equilibrium. You can't have great light without great darkness. So somebody who's afraid of going and integrating their psyche and actually working through the stuff in their head that they don't want to work through, they're not going to probably be emotionally deep to talk to as a person. And so when you realize this, and then you also realize that the love, sexuality, and sovereignty, and also warfare and death, that closely resembles Ishtar. Okay, when you study the stories of Ishtar and Inanna, Inanna is one of our oldest kind of hidden 13th characters going into the underworld and coming back up, the descending, ascending character. And so then when you put the biblical material side by side of Jeremiah, okay, you have the Judaites, they worship a celestial queen of heaven, okay, known as Ishtar related. And then you have Esther, a Jewish woman named Esther, who then resembles Ishtar, who becomes a queen. Okay, now if these are about stars, then what is she queen of? She's queen of heaven. And that's honestly what makes the Bible so interesting to study, like when you study the scriptures, is the writers are condemning these traditions, also preserve these traditions for us. And so there's kind of that paradox, because when Jeremiah tells people to stop making offerings to the Queen of Heaven, he tells us that people were making offerings to the Queen of Heaven. When the kings describe priests that were appointed to the sun, the moon, and the Mazzaroth and the hosts of heaven, they're preserving evidence that astral religion was within Judah in the tribes of Israel. When Ezekiel condemns people facing the east and worshiping the sun, the risen savior of the world, he's also showing us that that practice existed, and it still exists today in certain communities and in certain religious traditions of when people pray, they have to face a certain way. And also, not to get on another rabbit trail, I know this is probably a lot for you. This is how my brain works though. When you know spellcasting and you know how deep and esoteric these stories are and how they are, it's a book of blessings and curses. Like, let's say Psalms. There are certain Psalms that if you study certain, like, again, esoteric kind of occultist traditions, if you are going to curse your enemy, you are going to recite that psalm facing the west, and then you're going to turn to the east and recite a different psalm, which is all about blessings, to the east for yourself. And then you also see those blessings and curses along with other astral worship and imagery and understanding showing up in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Okay, the Dead Sea Scrolls contain a lot of different books about the stars and about hymns and a bunch of really cool stuff. If you ever want to check out that, I highly recommend reading those. And so you start to see a whole different world, and that is where, like, when people be like, no, this is all heresy. It's like, dude, what Christianity knows, especially with how much has been like whitewashed and watered down in these books, it's literally the tip of the fucking iceberg. It's like pre-K kind of schooling than what the Jewish writers actually intended and meant, and what the actual people who study these traditions and practice these traditions and the people that were a part of the mystery schools and then also are a part of the more esoteric, which is the inner circle, okay, the inner temple knowings, because Christianity is exoteric, EXO, as in the outer temple. This is what the masses get, but then esoteric is ESO, as in what the inner circle and the knowings get, because even as like the some Jewish mystic past, like the books literally say, do not teach somebody until they're ready, because this could hurt them, because kind of breaking apart somebody's construct of reality, it can fracture the psyche. And you can go into religious psychosis. You already see that happening in certain fundamentalist sects of, Jesus is returning any day now. But then you can also have spiritual psychosis. And so there has to be this grounding that happens in the body, because you're not trying to escape your body. You have to have equilibrium, balance of spirit and material of the physical. And that's where they did practice meditation quite a bit in the ancient world, because it helped to ground your energy and to ground your spirit in your body, so that way you could stay grounded in reality as you then began reconstructing and creating the life and new reality that you wanted to live. So ultimately, to wrap it up with this final statement, we need to start looking at the Bible and realize that it's not one interrupted theological system. Just like Christians aren't supposed to follow the Bible, they're supposed to follow Jesus. Like, if you've actually read your Bible all the way through, it literally tells you to stone your neighbor if they work on the Sabbath. It teaches you how to sell your kid for a goat. Like, this Bible has a lot of gruesome, disgusting things in it. Okay, and that's where it cracks me up, like when people are like, live a biblical life. It's like, have you read that Bible? Like, you really want to live a biblical life? I don't think so. There are a lot of things that are biblical, but not all things are Christ-like and reflect the heart and teachings of the canonical version of Jesus you have in that book, okay? So we need to stop looking at the Bible as one uninterrupted theological system and start looking at it as actually what it is, which is a library preserving centuries of religious development, cultural exchange, competing traditions, reform movements, mythology, celestial symbolism, and the changing ideas of who or what the divine is.